The thermometer outside Henrik Thorsson's cabin read -32 degrees, and inside his children's lips turned blue despite a fire that had consumed half a cord of wood in 6 hours. 3 cabins away, Magnus Vinter's family sat comfortably in wool shirts with no fire burning, the earthen floor beneath their feet radiating stored heat like a living thing, even though everyone in the settlement had mocked it as primitive and disgraceful for 18 months. Before we explore how one man's obsession with thermal mass changed frontier heating forever, let us know where you're watching from and hit subscribe. Tomorrow's story is even more unbelievable. Henrik Thorsson stood in Magnus Vinter's doorway at 2 in the morning on January 14, 1869, holding his youngest daughter against his chest. The child was 3 years old, and her skin had taken on the waxy pallor that frontier parents dreaded. Behind Henrik, his wife carried their infant son, and their 2 older children clung to her skirts. They had walked 300 yards through cold so severe that exposed skin froze in under a minute. Henrik's pride, which had sustained him through 18 months of mocking Magnus Vinter's floor, had shattered somewhere between putting another log on a fire that couldn't warm his cabin and watching his daughter's breathing become shallow. Magnus opened the door wider without speaking. Heat rolled out into the night, visible as a shimmer in the lamplight. Henrik stepped inside and stopped. The difference wasn't subtle. Magnus's cabin was warm, not survivable, not tolerable, but genuinely warm, the kind of warmth that made you want to remove your coat. Henrik looked down at the floor beneath his boots, the floor he had called a disgrace, a pig pen. Evidence of Magnus's descent into savage poverty. The earthen surface glowed faintly in the firelight, and when Henrik knelt to press his palm against it, the heat that radiated up through his glove made him pull back in shock. Magnus's wife, Ingrid, took the baby from Henrik's wife without comment and laid him on the floor near the fireplace. Not near the coals, but on the earthen surface itself, 6 feet from the hearth. The child's crying, which had been weak and intermittent, stopped within minutes. The older children sat directly on the floor, and Henrik watched as color returned to their faces. The earth beneath them was radiating heat, the way a stove radiates heat, steady and encompassing, warming from below in a way that wooden floors never could. Henrik lowered himself onto the packed earth. The warmth soaked through his wool pants immediately, into his legs, up through his spine. He had been cold for so long that the sensation was almost painful. His wife sat beside him, and within 10 minutes she was removing her outer coat. The children sprawled on the floor like they were lying on a feather bed, and Henrik realized they were warmer here, on bare earth, than they had ever been. In his cabin, with its proper wooden floor, elevated 18 inches above the ground, on good pine joists. The massive stone fireplace held only coals. The fire had clearly been banked hours ago, yet the cabin temperature had to be near 60 degrees. In Henrik's cabin, with a fire consuming wood at a rate that would bankrupt them by February, the temperature had steadily dropped to 14 degrees. His children had started shivering uncontrollably around midnight. By 1:30 his daughter had stopped shivering, which was worse. Henrik looked at the floor again, really looked at it. The surface wasn't crude. It was smooth, almost polished, with a faint sheen that suggested some kind of sealant. The color was uniform, a warm brown-gray, and the texture showed none of the cracks or irregularities he would have expected from packed dirt. This wasn't accident or poverty. This was engineering. Magnus had built something that defied everything Henrik understood about proper construction, and it was saving his children's lives while his own proper cabin had nearly killed them. The obsession that led Magnus Vinter to build a floor everyone mocked began on a February morning in 1867, when he found his father frozen in bed. Elias Vinter was 72 years old and had survived 40 winters in Wisconsin, including the brutal season of 1856 when temperatures stayed below zero for 38 consecutive days. He knew cold. He knew how to survive it. But on the night of February 9, 1867, knowing wasn't enough. Magnus had built his father a small cabin adjacent to his own the previous summer. It was good construction by frontier standards. Pine logs notched tight at the corners, mud and moss chinking packed carefully between gaps, a proper plank floor elevated on joists to keep it dry and level. The floor was made from white pine boards, each one hewn smooth, fitted tight, and pegged down securely. It was the kind of floor that marked civilization, that separated settlers from savages who lived on bare earth. Magnus had been proud of that floor. Elias had gone to bed at his usual hour. Magnus had checked on him around 9 that evening. The fire was burning well, the cabin was tolerably warm, and his father was in good spirits. They had talked briefly about spring planting plans. Magnus left him comfortable and returned to his own cabin 30 yards away. The temperature that night dropped to 18 below zero, cold but not unprecedented. Magnus woke at dawn, built up his own fire, and went to check on his father. The cabin was cold, not frigid, but cold enough that Magnus's breath was visible. The fire had gone out sometime in the night, probably around 3 in the morning, based on the ash. Elias was in his bed under 4 wool blankets and a bearskin. He wasn't moving. Magnus knew before he touched him. His father's skin was ice cold. The doctor who came later that day said Elias's heart had probably stopped around 4 in the morning. The cold hadn't killed him directly, but it had stressed his aging body beyond what it could endure. Magnus stood in that cabin for an hour after the doctor left, trying to understand. The fire had burned for perhaps 6 hours. The cabin should have retained some warmth, but when Magnus placed his palm on the plank floor, it was like touching ice. The wood wasn't just cold. It was actively pulling heat from the air, from the bed, from his father's body. Magnus knelt and looked under the floor through a gap in the foundation stones. Cold air moved freely in the space between the ground and the planks, circulating, carrying away any warmth that tried to settle. He examined the walls, the roof, the door. Everything was as tight as frontier construction allowed. But the floor, the proper civilized floor he had been so proud of, was a heat sink. Wood held no warmth. The elevated design created an air gap that guaranteed continuous heat loss. Magnus had built his father a cabin that looked right and functioned wrong. That realization, standing in the cold cabin with his father dead under blankets that hadn't been enough, changed everything Magnus thought he understood about shelter. Magnus buried his father on a hillside overlooking the settlement and spent the next week in a state that his wife Ingrid recognized as dangerous. He wasn't grieving normally. He was obsessing. He measured temperatures in his own cabin at different times of day and night. He crawled under the floor and documented how air moved through the joist space. He pressed his hands against the planks and felt how quickly they lost any warmth the fire created. He filled a bucket with hot water, poured it on one section of floor, and watched how fast the heat dissipated. The pattern was undeniable. During the day, when fires burned and people moved around, cabins felt adequately warm, but wooden floors contributed nothing to that warmth. They were simply platforms above cold ground. The moment a fire died or burned low, the floor became part of the problem. Wood conducted heat poorly in both directions. It didn't warm significantly from fire, and it didn't hold any heat it might absorb. Magnus visited every cabin in the settlement, asking questions that made people uncomfortable. How cold did their cabins get at night? How much wood did they burn in winter? Did their children complain about cold feet even near the fire? The answers were consistent. Everyone burned enormous amounts of wood. Everyone's cabins dropped to near freezing by dawn if fires weren't tended through the night. Everyone accepted this as normal. Henrik Thorsen told Magnus he was wasting time. Winter was hard, fires went out, people got cold. That was frontier life. Henrik's cabin was nearly identical to Magnus's. Good notched logs, proper chinking, elevated plank floor. Henrik was proud of his construction skills and had no patience for Magnus's strange questions about floor, temperatures, but Magnus couldn't let it go. He started reading everything available about buildings and heat. The settlement had few books, but a retired teacher named Wilhelm Brandt owned a small library. Wilhelm had technical manuals about European construction and architectural treatises. Magnus borrowed them all and read by firelight until Ingrid insisted he sleep. One passage stopped him. A German engineer describing thermal mass in masonry buildings. Heavy materials like stone or brick absorbed heat slowly during the day and released it slowly at night. A thick stone wall warmed by afternoon sun would radiate heat for hours after sunset. The mass acted as a battery, storing thermal energy and releasing it gradually. Magnus read it 4 times, then thought about root cellars and their stable temperatures year-round. He looked at his plank floor, thin wood elevated above earth, no mass, no storage, no stability, just a barrier that contributed nothing to survival. Magnus began wondering if everyone had been building floors wrong, if civilization's answer to bare earth was actually worse than what it replaced. In March of 1867, Magnus traveled to New Ulm, a town with real buildings. The trip took 2 days by wagon, but he needed to see structures built by people who understood more than frontier necessity. New Ulm had brick buildings, stone foundations, and a small college where German immigrants had brought European construction knowledge. Magnus spent a week there, sketching, measuring, and asking questions. He examined a brick warehouse built 5 years earlier. The building had no dedicated heating, just a single stove in the office, yet it stayed noticeably warmer than wooden buildings nearby. Magnus traced this to the brick mass. The walls were 2 feet thick and absorbed heat from sun exposure. Even in winter, that solar gain made a difference. The warehouse owner said once the building warmed in spring, it never got truly cold until deep winter. Magnus visited a root cellar behind a German farmer's house. The cellar was dug 8 feet deep with stone walls and an earth floor. Inside temperature was 45 degrees, though outside air was 20 degrees. The farmer explained that below frost depth, earth maintained steady temperature year-round. Deeper meant more stable. In summer, the cellar was cool. In winter, relatively warm. The earth's mass buffered against temperature extremes. A mason named Friedrich Holzer showed Magnus how stone foundations were built. Friedrich explained that stone absorbed heat during the day and released it at night. Heavy materials held heat, light materials didn't. Magnus asked about floors. Most buildings had wooden floors, but the church had flagstone. Friedrich said flagstone was cold to walk on, but excellent for temperature stability. The stone absorbed heat from any source and released it slowly. Wooden floors felt warmer to touch, but contributed nothing to thermal performance. On his last day, Magnus visited the college library. A mathematics professor let him examine engineering texts. Magnus found calculations for heat capacity. Stone held roughly twice the heat energy of wood per pound. Earth, depending on composition, held similar amounts to stone, but volume mattered more than weight. A floor could be much thicker than walls. 10 inches of earth would have enormous thermal storage capacity. Magnus made careful notes and sketched diagrams. When he returned home, Ingrid asked what he had learned. Magnus told her he was going to rebuild their floor. She asked what was wrong with their current floor. He said it contributed nothing to their survival, and he was going to build one that did. Ingrid looked at the good pine planks and asked if he had lost his mind. Magnus said possibly, but he was doing it anyway. Magnus returned from New Ulm in April with purchases that confused everyone who saw them. Most men returning from town brought practical supplies: flour, coffee, ammunition, fabric for their wives. Magnus brought 20 pounds of pure clay in canvas sacks, 10 pounds of powdered limestone, a set of measuring cups designed for apothecaries, and a wooden frame with wire mesh for sifting soil. He also purchased a book about adobe construction in Spanish territories, though he could barely read the English translation notes scribbled in the margins. Henrik Thorsen watched Magnus unload these items and asked what possible use clay and limestone could have on a frontier homestead. Magnus said he was experimenting with building materials. Henrik laughed and said Magnus should experiment with trapping more beaver, since that was how men actually made money. Magnus didn't argue. He simply stacked his supplies in the shed behind his cabin and began the work that would occupy him for the next 3 months. The first phase was testing earth composition. Magnus dug soil samples from different locations around his property. He sifted each sample through his wire mesh, removing rocks and organic debris. Then he mixed small batches using different ratios of earth to clay to limestone powder. He added water to each mixture and formed it into balls the size of apples. He let them dry for a week, then tested their hardness by striking them with a hammer and attempting to scratch them with a knife. Most mixtures crumbled or remained too soft. Too much clay created cracking as the samples dried. Too little clay meant the earth wouldn't bind properly. The limestone powder added hardness but made the mixture brittle if overused. Magnus kept detailed notes about each ratio. After 6 weeks of testing, he found a combination that produced hard, crack-free samples. 3 parts sifted earth, 2 parts clay, 1 part limestone powder, with water added until the consistency resembled thick porridge. The settlement watched this process with growing amusement. Gunnar Holt stopped by one afternoon and found Magnus mixing mud in a large wooden trough, working it with his bare feet like a man treading grapes. Gunnar asked if Magnus had given up on farming to become a potter. Magnus said he was developing a floor mixture. Gunnar stared at him. A floor mixture? Made of mud? Gunnar left, shaking his head. By June, the mockery had spread through the entire settlement. Children called Magnus's shed the mud house. Women mentioned it as evidence that grief had broken Magnus's mind. Henrik began calling the project Vinter's Pig Pen, since pigs lived on earth floors. When Magnus began digging up the interior of his cabin, removing the plank floor he had installed just 3 years earlier, the settlement's amusement turned to genuine concern. Ingrid watched her husband tear out perfectly good flooring and asked him one more time to reconsider. Magnus showed her his notes, his calculations, his dried test samples that were hard as stone. He explained thermal mass, heat capacity, storage, and release. Ingrid understood the words, but not the obsession. She finally said she would trust him, but if this failed, he was rebuilding the plank floor himself. Magnus agreed and kept digging. Magnus spent the evenings of June 1867 filling a leather-bound journal with calculations and diagrams. His formal education had ended at age 12, but he could do arithmetic and understood basic geometry. What he was attempting required more intuition than mathematics. He was trying to calculate how much heat a floor could store and for how long it could release that heat at a useful rate. He started with known quantities. A fire burning in his fireplace consumed roughly 1 cord of wood per month in deep winter. That fire produced heat that mostly went up the chimney or leaked through walls and roof. The question was how much heat could be captured and stored if a massive thermal battery sat directly in front of the fireplace, absorbing radiation for 12 hours a day. Magnus estimated his floor would be 10 inches thick and cover roughly 200 square feet. Using the density values he had found in the engineering texts and accounting for the air spaces in the earth mixture, he calculated the floor would weigh approximately 6,000 pounds. That mass, even with Earth's moderate heat capacity, could store enormous amounts of thermal energy. The question was how fast it would release that energy. He sketched diagrams showing heat flow. During the day, fire radiated heat in all directions. The stone fireplace absorbed some, the air absorbed some, but most escaped through the chimney or walls. A thick earthen floor directly in front of the fireplace would capture radiation that currently went into heating air that immediately leaked away. The floor would warm slowly, reaching perhaps 80 or 90 degrees at the surface by evening. At night, when the fire died down, the floor would begin releasing stored heat. The release rate would depend on the temperature difference between the floor and the air. If the floor was at 80 degrees and the air dropped to 30 degrees, Heat would flow from floor to air until they equalized. But with 6,000 pounds of thermal mass, that equalization would take many hours. Magnus estimated the floor would remain above 50 degrees until dawn, possibly longer. He compared this to his current plank floor. Wood had roughly half the heat capacity of earth per pound, and his plank floor weighed perhaps 300 pounds total. Even if it absorbed heat perfectly, which it didn't, the storage capacity was trivial. The elevated design meant cold air circulated beneath, pulling heat away through conduction faster than the fire could replace it. His father had died in a cabin where the floor actively worked against survival. Magnus calculated wood savings. If the floor maintained cabin temperature for 8 to 10 hours after the fire died, he could let it burn out at midnight instead of tending it through the night. That alone would save a third of his winter wood consumption. The floor would also even out temperature fluctuations, reducing the need for intense fires to combat cold drafts. Total savings might reach 50%. The engineering made sense. The mathematics supported it. But Magnus knew numbers meant nothing if the physical reality failed. Adobe buildings in Spanish territories proved earth could be structural. Root cellars proved earth could moderate temperature. But no one in Wisconsin was building earth floors in heated cabins. Either no one had thought of it, or there was a failure mode Magnus hadn't considered. Only construction would reveal which. Magnus started demolition in early July. He pried up the pine floorboards carefully, saving them for future use or sale. Beneath the planks, the joists sat on flat stones at 18-inch intervals. Magnus removed the joists, then the stones, exposing the bare earth that had been hidden for 3 years. The ground was dry and slightly compacted from the weight above it, but otherwise undisturbed. He marked the perimeter of the floor using stakes and string, defining the exact area he would excavate. The cabin's interior measured 14 feet by 16 feet, giving him 224 square feet of floor space. Magnus planned to dig down 8 inches below the original ground level before beginning to build up. This would give him a total floor thickness of 10 inches, with 2 inches below grade and 8 inches above, creating maximum thermal mass while keeping the floor level with the door threshold. The excavation took 4 days. Magnus used a shovel and a pickaxe, removing earth 1 bucket at a time and dumping it outside. He dug carefully, keeping the bottom level by checking with a long, straight board and a spirit level he had borrowed from Henrik. The irony of borrowing tools from the man who mocked his project most loudly wasn't lost on Magnus, but Henrik grudgingly admitted the excavation was at least competently done. Once the hole was complete, Magnus addressed drainage. Standing water in the floor mass would be catastrophic, causing rot, odor, and structural failure. He spread a 4-inch layer of gravel across the bottom of the excavation, using creek rock he had collected over several days. The gravel would allow any moisture that somehow penetrated the floor from above to drain down and dissipate into the earth below, preventing pooling. Next came the perimeter frame. Magnus installed a border of 6-inch tall logs around the entire floor edge, fitting them tight against the cabin's bottom wall logs. This frame would contain the earthen mixture as he built up the floor and provide a clean edge where floor met wall. He pegged the frame logs down into the gravel layer using wooden stakes, ensuring they wouldn't shift during construction. With the perimeter secured, Magnus began preparing his mixing area outside. He built a large wooden trough, 8 feet long and 3 feet wide, using planks left over from the floor demolition. This trough would be where he combined earth, clay, limestone powder, and water into the mixture that would become his floor. The trough had to be watertight and strong enough to withstand hours of mixing by foot. He positioned the trough near his cabin door for easy access. He stacked his clay sacks, limestone powder, and sifted earth in piles nearby. He filled 2 large barrels with water from the creek. He laid out wooden buckets for carrying mixed material into the cabin. Everything was ready. The settlement watched these preparations with continued amusement. Oscar Lindgren said it looked like Magnus was preparing to make the world's largest pottery vessel. Magnus said that was essentially correct, except the vessel would be a floor and it would save his family's lives come winter. The mixing process began on July 23, 1867. Magnus started at dawn because the work would take all day, and he wanted the first layer placed before evening. He dumped 3 buckets of sifted earth into the wooden trough, followed by 2 buckets of clay that he had soaked overnight to make it pliable. The clay came from a deposit he had found near the creek, blue-gray and sticky when wet, perfect for binding. He added half a bucket of limestone powder and began mixing. The traditional method for adobe involved treading the mixture with bare feet, and Magnus saw no reason to deviate from proven technique. He rolled up his pants and stepped into the trough. The material was cold and thick, resisting his efforts. He walked back and forth, working the earth and clay together, feeling the texture change as the components integrated. After 20 minutes of treading, he added water slowly from a bucket, pouring it in small amounts and continuing to mix with his feet. Too much water would make the mixture soupy and weak. Too little would prevent proper binding. Magnus was aiming for a consistency like thick mud, wet, enough to be workable, but dry enough to hold its shape when formed into a ball. Once the base mixture reached the right consistency, Magnus added his reinforcement material. He had spent the previous week cutting straw into 3-inch lengths using a hay knife. The chopped straw would serve the same purpose as the horsehair in traditional plaster, preventing cracks as the material dried and providing tensile strength that pure earth lacked. He added 2 large armfuls of straw to the mixture and continued treading, working the fibers throughout the mass. The straw changed the texture dramatically. The mixture became fibrous and cohesive, holding together in ways that pure earth and clay couldn't achieve. Magnus could see the straw pieces distributed evenly throughout, creating a 3-dimensional web of reinforcement. He tested the mixture by forming a handful into a ball. It held its shape without crumbling and showed no tendency to crack as it dried on the surface. Satisfied with the consistency, Magnus began transferring the mixture into wooden buckets for transport into the cabin. Each bucket held roughly 1 cubic foot of material and weighed about 60 pounds when full. He carried the buckets inside and dumped them onto the gravel base, spreading the mixture with a wooden float. The first layer would be 3 inches thick across the entire floor surface, requiring 7 full batches mixed in the trough outside. The work was exhausting. Treading the mixture until it reached a proper consistency took half an hour per batch. Carrying 60-pound buckets into the cabin, bending to spread the material, smoothing it level, then returning outside to mix another batch created a rhythm that left Magnus's legs and back aching. Ingrid helped by keeping water buckets filled and bringing food at midday, but the mixing and spreading had to be done by Magnus alone. By evening, the first 3-inch layer covered the entire floor. Magnus looked at it with satisfaction. 7 more layers to go. The first layer needed to dry for 2 days before Magnus could add the second. This curing time was critical. If he stacked wet layers too quickly, the weight would squeeze water from the lower layers, creating structural weakness and cracking. Magnus had learned this from his test samples. Patience in construction would prevent failure in use. While the first layer cured, Magnus prepared his compaction tool. He built a wooden tamper using a pine block 12 inches square and 4 inches thick attached to a handle 5 feet long. The tamper weighed 40 pounds, heavy enough to compress the earthen mixture, but light enough that Magnus could lift and drop it repeatedly for hours. He wrapped the bottom of the tamper with canvas to prevent it from sticking to the floor mixture. On July 26th, with the first layer firm enough to walk on, Magnus began compacting. He started in one corner and worked across the floor in a systematic pattern, lifting the tamper and dropping it, feeling the impact compress the material beneath. Each drop left a slight depression. Magnus made 3 complete passes across the entire floor, each pass creating additional compression. By the time he finished, the first layer had compressed from 3 inches to approximately 2.5 inches. The compaction served multiple purposes. It removed air pockets that would reduce thermal mass. It increased density, improving heat capacity. It created a harder surface that would support subsequent layers. Most importantly, it prevented settling that would create cracks and structural weakness over time. Magnus was building a floor that would last decades, and that required proper compaction of every single layer. The second layer went down on July 27th. Same mixing process, same treading, same straw reinforcement. Magnus had refined his technique slightly, adding the water in smaller increments and mixing longer to achieve better consistency. The second layer spread more easily over the compacted first layer, and Magnus worked carefully to eliminate any air pockets at the interface between layers. 2 more days of curing, then another session of compaction. The pattern repeated, third layer on July 31st, fourth layer on August 3rd. By mid-August, Magnus had built up 6 inches of compacted earthen floor. The cabin was unusable during this time, so Magnus and Ingrid lived in a temporary lean-to shelter behind the main structure. The summer weather made this tolerable, but Ingrid reminded Magnus daily that winter construction would have been impossible. Henrik stopped by in early August to see the progress. He looked at the partially completed floor and shook his head. All this work for a dirt floor. Magnus, you could have built an entire new cabin in the time you're spending on this foolishness. Magnus paused his tamper work and asked Henrik how much wood he had burned last winter. Henrik said roughly 4 cords, same as always. Magnus said he expected to burn 2 cords this winter, maybe less. Henrik laughed and said he'd believe that when he saw it. By late August, Magnus was laying the 7th layer. His hands were calloused from mixing and spreading. His shoulders ached from swinging the tamper. But the floor was taking shape exactly as he had envisioned. The surface was rising toward its final height, and the mass beneath his feet felt solid and permanent. 3 more layers to go. The final 3 layers required modified technique. Magnus wanted the floor surface to be harder and more moisture-resistant than the base layers, so he adjusted his mixture ratios. For layers 8 and 9, he increased the clay content slightly, going from 2 parts clay to 2.5 parts. The extra clay would create a denser, less porous surface. He also increased the limestone powder from 1 part to 1.5 parts, knowing the lime would harden as it cured. Layer 8 went down on August 24th. Magnus mixed it to a slightly wetter consistency than previous layers, which made it easier to spread smooth. He worked the material with his wooden float, pressing it firmly against layer 7 and smoothing the surface as level as possible. After 2 days of curing, he compacted it thoroughly, making 4 passes with the tamper instead of the usual 3. Layer 9 followed the same process. By early September, the floor surface was within 2 inches of its final height. Magnus was approaching the most critical phase. The top layer, layer 10, would be the surface his family walked on daily. It needed to be hard enough to resist wear, smooth enough to be comfortable, and sealed enough to prevent moisture penetration. This layer would also be the primary heat radiator, so surface quality mattered for thermal performance. For the final layer, Magnus modified his mixture significantly. He increased clay to 3 parts, keeping earth at 3 parts, but reducing limestone powder to 1/2 part. The reduced lime prevented excessive hardness that might cause surface cracking. He mixed this batch longer than any previous layer, treading for nearly an hour until the consistency was perfectly uniform. He added finely chopped straw, shorter pieces than before, for subtle reinforcement that wouldn't create visible texture. Magnus spread the final layer with obsessive care. He used a large wooden trowel instead of the float, working the material smooth in overlapping strokes. He checked level constantly, adding small amounts of mixture to low spots and smoothing high spots. The process took an entire afternoon for a layer that was only 2 inches thick. By evening, the floor surface was complete, smooth and even across its entire 224 square feet. The curing time for the top layer was extended to 5 days. Magnus wanted maximum hardness before applying the final sealant. During these 5 days, he prepared his sealing mixture, linseed oil and beeswax heated together in a pot until the beeswax dissolved. The ratio was 4 parts oil to 1 part wax. This mixture would penetrate the floor surface, filling microscopic pores and creating a moisture barrier while allowing the floor to breathe. On September 12th, Magnus applied the sealant. He poured it onto the floor in small amounts and spread it with rags, working it into the surface with circular motions. The floor absorbed the mixture eagerly, darkening to a rich brown. Magnus applied 3 coats over 2 days, each coat penetrating less than the previous as the surface became saturated. The final result had a soft sheen, not glossy but definitely sealed. The floor looked intentional, crafted, permanent. Not primitive, but engineered. Magnus and Ingrid moved back into their cabin on September 20th, 1867. The floor had cured for a full week after the final sealant application, and Magnus deemed it ready for use. He carried their belongings back inside carefully, watching how the floor responded to weight and traffic. The surface showed no give, no cracking, no weakness. It felt solid underfoot, almost stone-like, with a slight warmth to the touch even though no fire had been lit. The first visitors arrived within hours. Henrik Thorsen brought his wife to see what 3 months of labor had produced. They stood in the doorway, staring at the floor with expressions that mixed disbelief and pity. Henrik walked across it slowly, his boots making soft contact with the sealed surface. He knelt and pressed his palm against it, then looked up at Magnus. "This is what you spent 3 months building? A dirt floor?" Magnus nodded. Henrik's wife asked if it would turn to mud when they spilled water or tracked in snow. Magnus said the sealant made it water-resistant, and the clay content meant spills would sit on the surface rather than soaking in. He demonstrated by pouring a cup of water onto the floor. The water beaded slightly and pooled without penetrating. Magnus wiped it up with a rag, leaving the floor unmarked. Henrik stood and examined the walls, the ceiling, anything except the floor. He finally said that all the engineering and mixing didn't change the basic fact that Magnus was living on dirt like an animal. Civilized people had wooden floors. Henrik had laid plank floors in 4 cabins over the years, and he was proud of that work. This, gesturing at the earthen surface, was a step backward. Magnus asked how much firewood Henrik planned to cut for winter. Henrik said 4 cords, same as last year. Magnus said to remember that number come February. Over the next week, most of the settlement stopped by to see Magnus's floor. Gunnar Holt examined it with a builder's eye and admitted the craftsmanship was excellent, but questioned why anyone would apply such craftsmanship to earth. Oscar Lindgren asked if Magnus planned to install a proper floor on top of this base. Magnus said this was the floor, complete and final. Oscar asked what Magnus would tell visitors, that he was too poor for lumber. Magnus said he would tell them it was thermal mass for heat storage, and if they didn't understand that, their opinion didn't matter. The women were harsher in their judgment than the men. Several told Ingrid directly that they would be ashamed to live on a dirt floor, regardless of how smooth it looked. One suggested Magnus's grief over his father had broken his reason. Another said the floor made their cabin look like a root cellar or a barn. Ingrid defended her husband publicly, but admitted to him privately that the social cost was significant. By early October, the settlement had reached consensus. Magnus Winter had wasted 3 months of productive work and good money on materials to build something that marked him as either crazy or desperately poor. The nickname Winter's Pigpen was now used openly. Children made jokes about it. Magnus ignored all of it and began cutting firewood for winter, half the amount he had cut the previous year. The first serious cold arrived in late October. Temperatures dropped into the 20s at night, and Magnus lit his first fire of the season on October 26th. He had rebuilt his fireplace over the summer, making it larger and positioning it to radiate maximum heat toward the floor. The firebox was deep, designed to hold substantial fuel and create intense heat for extended periods. Magnus built the fire in the afternoon and let it burn hot for 6 hours. He monitored the floor temperature by touch, feeling it warm gradually. The surface near the fireplace reached roughly 90 degrees by evening, warm enough to be uncomfortable for bare feet. 3 feet from the hearth, the floor was perhaps 70 degrees. At the far wall, it remained cool but noticeably warmer than the ambient air temperature. The real test came that night. At midnight, Magnus let the fire die down to coals, then banked it completely. He and Ingrid went to bed with the cabin temperature at a comfortable 62 degrees. Magnus woke twice during the night to check temperatures. At 3 in the morning, the cabin was still 58 degrees, and the floor near the fireplace was warm to touch. At 6 in the morning, just before dawn, the cabin temperature had dropped to 53 degrees, but the floor continued radiating perceptible heat. Magnus rebuilt the fire at dawn and recorded his observations in his journal. The floor had maintained cabin warmth for 6 hours after the fire died, exactly as his calculations predicted. In contrast, his previous plank floor would have been ice cold within 2 hours of the fire going out, and the cabin temperature would have dropped below 40 degrees by dawn. Over the next week, Magnus refined his burning schedule. He found that a hot fire from 4 in the afternoon until midnight provided enough heat storage to keep the cabin comfortable until morning. The floor acted exactly like the thermal battery he had envisioned. It charged during evening hours when the fire burned intensely, then discharged through the night when the fire was out. The cycle repeated daily with remarkable consistency. Ingrid noticed the difference in comfort immediately. Their previous cabin had temperature swings of 30 or 40 degrees between evening and morning. Now the variation was less than 10 degrees. She could walk barefoot on the floor at any time without the shock of cold wood. The children, when they visited, sprawled on the floor near the fireplace and fell asleep there, something impossible on cold plank floors. By November, Magnus had established his winter routine. 1 hot fire per evening, banked at midnight, rebuilt at dawn. His wood consumption was running at exactly half the previous winter's rate. He mentioned this to Henrik in passing. Henrik said the real test would come in January when temperatures dropped below 0. Anyone could heat a cabin in mild autumn weather. Magnus agreed and said he looked forward to January's validation. The floor continued performing flawlessly. No cracks appeared despite thermal cycling. The sealant held against tracked-in snow and spills. The surface showed no wear from daily traffic. Magnus had built something that worked exactly as intended, and every day it saved firewood and maintained comfort. The settlement remained skeptical, but Magnus no longer cared about their opinions. December brought sustained cold. Temperatures stayed below freezing for 2 weeks straight, dropping into the teens at night. Magnus continued his evening fire schedule and monitored floor performance with systematic precision. He placed water in cups at various distances from the fireplace to gauge temperature distribution. He timed how long the floor retained heat. He calculated wood consumption daily and compared it to previous winters. The data confirmed his theoretical predictions. The floor surface temperature peaked at 92 degrees near the fireplace after 6 hours of hot fire. The thermal gradient across the floor was smooth, with the far wall areas maintaining 55 to 60 degrees even when ambient air temperature outside dropped to 15 degrees. The floor released stored heat for 8 to 10 hours after the fire died, keeping cabin temperature above 50 degrees through the entire night. Wood consumption was running at 48% of the previous winter's rate. Magnus had burned 0.9 cords by mid-December compared to 1.7 cords the previous year for the same period. The savings were even better than his calculations predicted, primarily because the stable temperature meant he needed less intense fires. His previous plank floor cabin required roaring fires to combat the constant heat loss through the cold floor. The earthen floor contributed to warmth rather than draining it. Ingrid noticed secondary benefits Magnus hadn't anticipated. Humidity in the cabin remained more stable because the floor absorbed and released moisture along with heat. Their clothing and bedding dried faster when laid on the warm floor overnight. Food stored on floor-level shelves stayed fresher because temperature fluctuations were minimal. The cabin felt fundamentally different, more stable, more comfortable in ways that were hard to quantify but obvious in daily living. Magnus documented everything in his journal. He sketched temperature distribution diagrams. He recorded daily wood consumption. He noted that the floor's thermal mass created a buffering effect that extended beyond nighttime heating. On cloudy days when the fire burned at reduced intensity, the floor released stored heat from previous days, maintaining comfort. The mass acted as a thermal reservoir that averaged out daily variations. Henrik stopped by in mid-December and found Magnus lying on the floor near the fireplace, reading by lamplight. The fire had been out for 3 hours, yet Henrik could feel warmth radiating from the earthen surface. He asked Magnus about wood consumption. Magnus showed him the journal entries. Henrik studied the numbers silently, then asked if Magnus was certain about the measurements. Magnus said he weighed every piece of wood before burning it and tracked every fire with precision. Henrik mentioned that his own wood supply was depleting faster than expected. He had already burned through 2 cords, and winter was barely started. At this rate, he would need 5 cords total, more than he had cut. Magnus said nothing, just let the numbers speak. Henrik left without commenting further on the floor, but his skepticism had shifted to something closer to concern. What if Magnus was right? What if everyone else was burning twice the wood they needed? The extreme cold arrived on January 11, 1869. A weather system from Canada brought temperatures that dropped to -20 degrees by evening and continued falling through the night. By dawn on January 12th, the thermometer outside Henrik's cabin read -28 degrees. By the following dawn, -32 degrees. The cold was the kind that killed livestock, froze water buckets solid in minutes, and made breathing painful. Henrik's family burned wood constantly. His fireplace consumed logs at a rate that would have seemed wasteful in normal winter conditions, but the cold was so extreme that the cabin temperature barely stayed above 20 degrees. His children wore every piece of clothing they owned to bed. His wife layered blankets until the children could barely move beneath the weight. The plank floor was like a sheet of ice. Standing on it pulled heat from their feet so quickly that the children cried when they had to walk across it. Henrik burned through half a cord of wood in 3 days. The fire never went out, yet the cabin never warmed. The problem wasn't the fire's intensity, but the floor's betrayal. Every bit of heat that settled toward the floor was immediately conducted away by the cold wood and dissipated into the frozen air circulating beneath the planks. The floor wasn't neutral, it was actively hostile to survival. By January 14th, Henrik's youngest daughter showed signs of dangerous cold exposure. Her fingers were white and numb. Her lips had taken on a bluish tint. She was lethargic, sleeping for long periods, and waking confused. Henrik's wife recognized the signs from stories she had heard. The child was losing the fight against cold. The cabin that was supposed to protect them was failing. Oscar Lindgren's situation was even worse. His cabin was smaller than Henrik's, and his infant son was less than 6 months old. The baby couldn't generate body heat effectively and couldn't communicate distress beyond crying. On the night of January 13th, the baby's crying became weak and intermittent. Oscar's wife held him against her body constantly, but she could feel the cold winning. The plank floor radiated cold upward. The walls leaked heat. The fire consumed wood frantically, but couldn't overcome the fundamental design failure. Gunnar Holt, who had mocked Magnus most consistently over the past 18 months, found his own cabin dropping to 12 degrees despite burning wood at a rate that would bankrupt him by February. He had 3 grandchildren staying with him, and all 3 were showing cold stress symptoms. Gunnar realized sometime around midnight on January 14th that pride was about to kill children. The cabins everyone had considered proper and civilized were death traps in extreme cold. 3 families made the decision independently around 2 in the morning on January 15th. They bundled their children, took blankets, and walked through cold so severe that exposed skin froze in seconds. They walked toward the cabin everyone had mocked, toward the pig pen with the primitive dirt floor, toward Magnus Vinter's impossible floor that somehow, impossibly, was keeping his family alive, while proper construction failed everywhere else. Henrik arrived first, as described in Chapter 1. Magnus opened his door to find Henrik holding his daughter, his wife carrying the baby, the older children clinging to their mother's skirts. Magnus stepped aside without speaking. Heat rolled out into the night. Henrik's family stumbled inside and felt the temperature difference like a physical impact. The cabin was warm, genuinely, impossibly warm. The earthen floor glowed with stored heat. Oscar Lindgren arrived 10 minutes later with his wife and infant son, then Gunnar Holt with his 3 grandchildren. By 3 in the morning, 12 people crowded into Magnus's cabin, which was designed for a family of 4. They sat on the floor, lay on the floor, pressed themselves against the warm earth surface. The children stopped crying within minutes. Color returned to faces. The infant stopped his weak, intermittent sounds and fell into normal sleep. Magnus built up the fire not because the cabin needed heat, but because the crowd had dropped the temperature and the floor would need recharging. He said nothing to anyone. Ingrid brought water and bread. The visitors ate mechanically, still processing what they were experiencing. Henrik kept touching the floor, his hand returning to the warm surface repeatedly, as if he couldn't believe what he was feeling. The fire burned hot for 2 hours. The floor absorbed the heat and radiated it back. By dawn, the cabin temperature had stabilized at 60 degrees despite having 3 times the normal occupancy. Outside, the temperature was negative 32 degrees. The difference was 92 degrees. Henrik's cabin, with constant fire, had maintained 14 degrees. The difference there was 46 degrees. Magnus's floor had created a 44-degree advantage, exactly what the eventual documentation would record. Gunnar was the first to speak about it directly. He was 71 years old and had built cabins for 50 years. He had notched logs in 4 states and 2 territories. He had considered himself an expert in frontier construction. He looked at Magnus and said he had been wrong, completely, dangerously wrong. This floor wasn't primitive. It was the most advanced heating system he had ever encountered. Henrik asked how it worked. Magnus explained thermal mass, heat capacity, storage, and release. He described how the floor absorbed radiation from the fireplace for hours, storing thermal energy in 6,000 pounds of earth. At night, that energy released slowly, maintaining temperature for 8 to 10 hours. The thick mass prevented the rapid temperature collapse that plank floors couldn't prevent. Physics, not magic. Engineering, not luck. Oscar asked why no one had built floors this way before. Magnus said he didn't know. Maybe because earth floors seemed primitive. Maybe because elevations seemed necessary. Maybe because no one had done the calculations. The reasons didn't matter now. What mattered was that the principle worked, the engineering was sound, and lives were being saved. The family stayed in Magnus's cabin for 2 days. The cold snap continued, but Magnus's floor maintained warmth using normal amounts of wood. The children recovered fully. The adults slept on the warm earth and woke without the bone-deep cold that had become normal. When the temperature finally rose above 0 on January 17th, 3 men began planning to tear out their plank floors. Henrik Thorsen began demolition of his plank floor on February 1, 1869. The extreme cold had broken, but winter was far from over. Henrik couldn't face another potential cold snap with a floor that had nearly killed his children. He asked Magnus for detailed instructions on mixture ratios, layer thickness, compaction technique, and sealant preparation. Magnus provided his journal, complete with calculations and observations from 18 months of development and testing. Henrik's construction took longer than Magnus's had. He was learning the process while building, making mistakes that required correction. His first mixture was too wet and wouldn't compact properly. His second was too dry and crumbled. By the third attempt, he matched Magnus's consistency. The work was backbreaking, exactly as Magnus had warned. Each layer required a full day of mixing, spreading, and compacting. Henrik's hands blistered from tamperwork. His back ached constantly, but Henrik persevered because he remembered his daughter's blue lips and weak breathing. He remembered the floor that had radiated cold instead of warmth. By mid-March, Henrik had completed 6 layers. By early April, his floor was finished. He applied the linseed oil and beeswax sealant exactly as Magnus had instructed and waited for curing. His family moved back in on April 20th. Oskar Lindgren started his floor reconstruction in March. He had less carpentry skill than Henrik and made more errors, but Magnus visited regularly to provide guidance. Gunnar Holt began in April, moving his family in with his son while his cabin floor was rebuilt. By summer, 3 families in the settlement had earthen thermal mass floors. All 3 reported dramatic reductions in wood consumption and improvements in winter comfort during the following cold season. The technique spread beyond the immediate settlement. Travelers stopping through heard about the floors that stayed warm through extreme cold. They asked questions, examined the construction, and carried the knowledge to other communities. A trapper named Ernst Wagner built an earthen floor in his winter cabin in northern Minnesota and reported that his heating wood needs dropped by half. A homesteader in Dakota Territory named Klaus Zimmerman installed one and wrote a letter to a territorial newspaper describing the results. By 1871, earthen thermal mass floors had appeared in scattered locations across Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Dakota Territory. The technique was spreading organically, shared through word of mouth, and demonstrated results. No one was promoting it commercially. No one was claiming credit or seeking profit. The innovation spread because it solved a real problem better than any alternative. The floors varied in execution. Some builders used more clay, others more earth. Some sealed with oils, others with wax, some with both. Thickness ranged from 8 inches to 14 inches, depending on builder preference and patience, but the core principle remained constant. Massive earthen floor plus large fireplace equals passive thermal storage that maintains warmth through the night using half the wood of elevated plank floors. By 1875, earthen thermal mass floors had become standard construction in the coldest regions of the northern frontier. Settlements in areas where winter temperatures regularly dropped below -20 degrees adopted the technique at rates approaching 50%. The pattern was clear. The harsher the climate, the faster the adoption. In moderate climates where wood was abundant and winters mild, traditional plank floors remained dominant. But in extreme environments where survival margins were thin, Magnus's innovation became essential infrastructure. The technique evolved as it spread. A Norwegian immigrant named Sven Halvorsen discovered that adding a thin layer of sand beneath the gravel drainage improved stability. A German builder named Friedrich Kemper found that mixing charcoal dust into the top layer created a darker surface that absorbed fireplace radiation more efficiently. A Finnish family named Virtanen developed a variation using peat mixed with clay, which worked well in areas where peat was more available than suitable earth. Documentation began to appear in regional newspapers and agricultural journals. The Dakota Territorial Pioneer published an article in 1873 titled The Thermal Floor, a Solution to Winter. Heating Costs. The article included testimonials from 7 families reporting wood consumption reductions between 40 and 60%. A Wisconsin Agricultural Extension bulletin in 1874 provided detailed construction instructions, crediting innovative frontier builders without naming Magnus specifically. The wood savings had economic implications beyond individual households. Communities that adopted thermal mass floors collectively reduced winter wood consumption by thousands of cords. This reduced pressure on local forests, lowered wood prices due to decreased demand, and freed up labor that would have been spent on wood cutting for other productive activities. The environmental impact was measurable. Regions with high thermal floor adoption showed slower rates of deforestation compared to similar regions using traditional construction. Children's winter health improved in documented ways. Settlement doctors in Minnesota and Wisconsin noted decreased rates of cold-related illness in families with thermal mass floors. Frostbite cases dropped. Respiratory infections declined, likely due to more stable indoor temperatures and humidity levels. Infant mortality during winter months showed small but statistically significant improvements in communities where thermal floors became common. The floors were saving lives through mechanisms Magnus had never explicitly predicted, but which emerged from the stable thermal environment. The construction technique became refined through collective experience. Builders developed standards for mixture ratios, layer thickness, and compaction. The consensus settled on 3 parts earth to 2 parts clay to 1 part lime, with straw reinforcement at roughly 10% by volume. 8 to 10 inches of compacted thickness became standard. Curing time of 2 days between layers was universally adopted. The linseed oil and beeswax sealant remained the preferred finish, though some builders used pine resin as a cheaper alternative. By 1880, an estimated 500 cabins and small homes across the northern frontier had thermal mass floors based on Magnus's original innovation. The technique had become part of regional building tradition, taught by experienced builders to apprentices, passed from father to son, shared among neighbors. The engineering principle was understood. Heavy materials store heat, light materials don't. The practical application had proven itself through 2 decades of hard use in the harshest climate conditions North America could offer. Magnus Vinter died on March 4, 1893, at the age of 68. He had lived quietly in the same cabin for 26 years, maintained his farm, raised children who moved to cities for opportunities their parents had never known. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his survival through early frontier years and his service to the community, but made no reference to the floor that had launched. A construction revolution. Magnus had never sought recognition and wouldn't have wanted it mentioned at his death. His cabin stood until 1927. By then, the settlement had grown into a small town with modern buildings and steam heating systems. The old log cabins were demolished to make room for progress. A crew tearing down Magnus's cabin encountered the earthen floor and noted its unusual construction in their work records. They measured it at 9.5 inches thick after 60 years of use, still solid, still intact. The crew foreman commented that it was built better than most modern concrete floors. Then they broke it up with pickaxes and hauled it away. Modern historians studying frontier construction patterns began recognizing thermal mass floors in the 1960s. Archaeological excavations of abandoned homesteads found evidence of compacted earth floors with traces of straw reinforcement and oil sealants. Building historians documented the technique in oral histories collected from descendants of frontier families. Academic papers analyzed the thermodynamics and confirmed the 40 to 60% heating efficiency improvements that 19th century builders had claimed. The principle Magnus discovered through obsessive calculation and experimentation is now understood as basic passive solar thermal design. Modern architects use the same concept in energy-efficient homes. high thermal mass floors, typically concrete, positioned to absorb heat from sunlight or radiant heating systems, releasing that heat slowly to maintain stable indoor temperatures. The specific implementation differs from Magnus's earthen floors, but the physics is identical. Mass stores heat. Storage stabilizes temperature. Stability reduces energy consumption. What Magnus couldn't have known in 1867 was that he was rediscovering principles ancient civilizations had understood. Adobe structures in the American Southwest had used thermal mass for centuries before European settlement. Roman hypocaust systems used massive stone floors as heat storage. Traditional earth construction across Asia, Africa, and Europe incorporated thermal mass instinctively. Magnus, isolated on the Wisconsin frontier with only books and observation, reconstructed knowledge that had been lost when European settlers defaulted to wood construction. His specific contribution was adapting thermal mass principles to frontier log cabin construction in extreme cold climates. No one before him had combined massive earthen floors with oversized fireplaces in elevated log structures designed for northern winters. The innovation wasn't inventing thermal mass, but engineering it for a specific application where it hadn't been tried. That practical adaptation, shared freely and adopted organically, saved lives and resources across 2 decades and thousands of square miles. The earthen floors are gone now, broken up and buried under modern development. Magnus's name appears in no engineering textbooks, but the principle endures, rediscovered by each generation that takes building science seriously enough to question assumptions and test alternatives.